Good morning and welcome to Sunday Mornings at the Marxist Library. The Nebel Proctor Marxist Library is a brick and mortar institution in Oakland, California. But since the pandemic, we have been meeting via Zoom. So good morning to those of you on the left coast and good morning to, and perhaps afternoon and good afternoon to others, and even good evening if you're from more distant places. This weekly program is organized by the Institute of the Critical Study of Society, the ICSS. And this session is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube with a link to our website. And our website is ICSS, the initials, Marx, the word, one word, .org, ics.org, and that'll be up in a couple of days. And my name is Roger Harris, and I'm with the program committee for the ICSS. For over a decade and a half, Monday mornings at the Marxist Library programs have been a platform for diverse presentations on a variety of topics: political economy, the struggles of the working class to fight against imperialism and militarism, and so forth. But you definitely do not have to be a Marxist to either present or to participate in our programs. However, we, the Institute for the Critical Study of Society, the ICSS, are united in our respect for the work of Karl Marx, and we believe that his work remains relevant today. You can sign up for email notifications for future programs, view past programs, and contact us through our website. Again, that's icsmarx.org. And you're always welcome to give us our input, feedback, and suggestions for topics and speakers. Before we start, I'd like to remind you that this is a forum for comradely discussion. Our presentation today will run probably about half an hour, 45 minutes. We'll see how much Dan wants to take in the formal presentation. That will be followed by a few announcements, and then we'll have a robust Q&A, and then we'll hope to close this session up around 10:30 Pacific Daylight Time. Now, our speaker today is a dear friend and comrade, Dan Kovalik. He's an international human rights advocate and lawyer, and he just returned from observing the March 17th presidential elections in Russia. He was in the Kherson Oblast, which experienced terrorist attacks and which were designed to disrupt the election. And Dan will report back on the current Ukraine conflict in light of historical developments, and in particular, the breakup of the Soviet Union and so forth. Dan has written extensively on international human rights and U.S. foreign policy. He has lectured throughout the world on these subjects and appears frequently on RT. He's the author of a number of books, and most importantly right now, on May 28th, his latest book will be out on the Palestinian conflict. And we'll be really looking forward to reading that book. In the chat, there's information on how to get a pre-publication copy of the book. And Dan, we certainly hope that you would come back later to tell us more about that book. But without any further introduction, Dan, it's all yours. And we're looking forward to hearing what you had about your trip to Russia and your thoughts about the international implications.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, Roger. Always great to see you. Great to see everyone and be part of the Marxist Library discussions. A lot to talk about. Hard to know where exactly to start, but yeah, so I was an election observer, as Roger said, for the elections in which Putin, as people expected, Vladimir Putin was resoundingly reelected. There was huge voter turnout, around 77%, I think. And Putin got something like 87, 88% of the vote. So that's pretty incredible. As a moral victory, and they considered it a moral victory, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation did come in second, which is what they didn't campaign hard at all. And I think there was a combination of one, that the government didn't want them to campaign, and also they just felt like Putin was an unmovable force that they were not going to defeat, so they didn't They didn't try very hard, and they got just about 4.4% of the vote, and there were three other parties who divided the remainder. But as I said, they came in second, and they were happy with that. So I think until Putin leaves the scene, it's going to be very difficult for any opposition to challenge him. I was in the Kherson Oblast, which, if you don't know what that is, it is one of the four regions. They call them the new regions that joined Russia after the special military operations began in February of 2022. So there were referendums, or referenda, I guess, in the four regions: Kherson Oblast, Donetsk, Luhansk, in Zaporozhye, where the nuclear power plant is. Those are the four regions that through referenda joined Russia, rejoined Russia in September of 2022. And it's important to mention that they rejoined Russia because these are regions that has historically been part of Russia going back to Catherine the Great, okay, in the mid 1800s. And were very much also part of the Soviet Union, of course. These are all Russian-speaking provinces, primarily Russian-speaking, though pretty much everyone in Ukraine speaks Ukrainian and Russian. But again, some people focus more on Russian, others Ukrainian. And in these four regions, these are Russian-speaking regions. And these are regions that never felt very happy about being part of Ukraine after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And they became less so after the 2014 Maidan coup, which brought to power a government very hostile to the Russian-speaking peoples. You know, they suppressed the Russian language, made it illegal to teach in schools. It had always been you could study Russian or Ukrainian in the schools, and sometimes other languages, depending where you were. In Crimea, for example, you could learn Tatar, the Tatar language as well. And that ended after 2014. They made it Ukrainian, the only state language and the only language you could learn in schools. They tried to suppress Russian culture, the government in Kiev, and they destroyed many Russian and Soviet monuments. So when I talk to people in Kherson, for example, so we had this, I tried to be very frank with people and pointed with people. I said, look, I'm from the United States. And when we're being told, the Kherson Oblast and these other regions were invaded by Russia in February 2022, that, you're part of Russia now against your will. What do I tell people when they say that or they ask about that? And I got very emotional responses. People, very quickly, the first thing they came to is, how would you feel if living in the United States, they outlawed English? Even though that's your native tongue, that's what you've been speaking your whole life. Well, that's what happened to us. Our native tongue, Russian, was outlawed. And we were like second-class citizens. And the other way they were second-class citizens is the government in Kiev did not invest very much in terms of development in these regions. And I'll give you an example of what I witnessed in terms of that. First of all, the Kherson Oblast is huge. And why am I saying the Oblast as opposed to Kherson? Because part of Kherson region is still under Ukrainian control, west of the Dnieper River, okay? And that includes Kherson City. And when you say Kherson, you're meaning Kherson City, unless you make it clear it's the Oblast, okay? But the government in Kiev did very little for Kherson. So we drove, even the Russian part of Kherson is huge. We drove hours in which you see nothing but farmland. But we drove on these roads that were mud for hours, mud roads. These should be major expressways, But again, even the roads weren't built or maintained. by the government in Kiev. And one thing, again, the people in Kherson are happy about is that the Russians are starting to build stuff. They're starting to pave the roads. They're starting to build infrastructure and hospitals and whatnot. And that people need to understand that. That's something people don't think about or know about. And again, that came up a lot. People feel like they're getting infrastructure, they're able to speak their language, able to have their culture, and they have more opportunities than they had when they were part of Ukraine. But one of these, what this goes back to, and this is where I think the collapse of the Soviet Union is very important to discuss here. And it's very important to basically say that the conflict you're seeing in Ukraine today is nothing but the reverberations of the collapse of the USSR. And also, let's talk about that collapse. First of all, it is almost always called a collapse. It wasn't a collapse. Soviet Union did not collapse. It was willed out of existence by three drunk guys in the woods. Okay, and let me talk about the three drunk guys in the woods. I'm sure most of you or all of you know about this, but let's remind ourselves what happened in Russia, in the Soviet Union, in 1991. A lot was happening then. First of all, and this is very important, let's remind ourselves that in earlier part of 1991, there was a nationwide referendum throughout the Soviet Union. And the people of the Soviet Union were asked whether they wanted the Soviet Union to continue. And 78% of the people who voted said they wanted the Soviet Union to continue. This is very important because what comes later, and the Chinese have recently said this. Do you remember this? The Chinese have talked about this at the UN, that ultimately when the Soviet Union is decided out of existence by these three drunk guys in the woods, that was illegal. It was against the Constitution of the Soviet Union. It was against the will of the people as expressed in this referendum, and that has to be kept in mind. The other referendum that happened, and I mentioned this before, and I didn't know this until I went to Crimea last May. I did not know about this referendum. The people in Crimea specifically had a referendum in January of 1991 in which they voted to become an independent Soviet republic. Why did they do that? Because they were afraid that the Soviet Union may break up, right? And in anticipation of that, they did not want to be part of Ukraine if that happened. They were given, as most of you know, to Ukraine by Khrushchev in 1954 in an arbitrary decision. Crimea, again, was part of Russia, part of the Russian Empire since Catherine the Great. It is a Russian area. Yes, there are Ukrainians there. Yes, there are Tatars there, but it is mostly Russian. The culture is Russian. The language is Russian. If the Soviet Union split up, they did not want to go with Ukraine. So instead, they opted to be independent. Now, so what happens later? In December, I have this December 8th, 1991, despite those two referenda, okay, the three drunk guys in the woods, and again, this is a term used to me by a Crimean, and it stuck with me, and I thought it was a brilliant way to describe what happened, three drunk guys in the woods. Boris Yeltsin of Russia, Kravchuk of Ukraine, and Shishkevich of Belarus. Okay, those are the three big republics. Those are considered the three essential republics of the Soviet Union. They meet in the forest and they decide on their own, without consulting anyone. They'd already consulted the population who said, we want to be part of the Soviet Union. They decided to end the Soviet Union on their own. There are a number of other republics. They weren't there. But within that month, so that was December 8th, 1991, they made that decision. As I always talk about, one of the saddest days of my life, December 25th, Christmas Day, 1991, the hammer and sickle is taken down from the Kremlin, and the Soviet Union is gone. Number one, as I mentioned, that was against the will of the Soviet peoples to break up the Soviet Union. But in addition, it was undemocratic the way it was split up. The Crimeans did not want to go with Ukraine, but they went with Ukraine because that is what was decided by the drunk guys in the woods. The Donbass, which is the two regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, they would not have wanted to go with Ukraine, but no one asked them. So they were pulled into Ukraine. So was Kherson Oblast, so was Zaporozhye, so was Odessa, which was also goes back to Catherine the Great. So in 2014, when this right-wing government is put in power through the connivance of the United States, and becomes a very aggressively right-wing, anti-Russian speaking, anti-ethnic Russian force in the country, you have Crimea decide almost immediately, we're out. We already said we were out in 1991, but we're saying we're out again. But given the fact that you're a power and you want us in and we want out, now we're going to have a referendum to join Russia. Okay, we'd rather be part of Russia than you. And so they joined Russia. That happened in 2014. What also happened in 2014, for the same reason, Donetsk and Luhansk became independent republics, but based on referenda that they held to do that. And this makes sense for them. It makes sense that they would want to do this because of their historic ties to Russia, their historic ties to the Soviet Union, and because of the repression that was brought upon them by the government in Kiev, which, as you know, broke out into a full war between Kiev, the government in Kiev, and the Donbass after they declared independence. And 14,000 people died in that war before Russia invaded, if that's what you want to call it, or intervened in February 2022. These are facts that very few Americans understand. And obviously, because they don't want, the government and the media don't want you to understand these things. They want you to think that the big bad Russians invaded these foreign lands who had nothing to do with them and against their will out of a sheer desire to engage in imperial expansion, which is absolutely not true. It was, my sense when definitely in Donetsk, which I've been to twice, and Crimea, no question the people are happy they're part of Russia again. It's very clear Luhansk is as well. And when I was in Kherson, my view or my anecdotal evidence that I saw was that people were glad to be part of Russia again. And they voted in large numbers in the election, and they voted in large numbers for Putin. And when you saw, a couple of people mentioned to me, there was about 10 observers on my team. There were 1,000 observers in toto, international observers of this election from all over the world. On my team, there were about 10. And a number of people from Africa were on it, some Europeans as well. I was the only American. And a couple of people said, don't you notice it's all old ladies we see voting? And I said, yeah, well, first of all, because there's no old men, because these women who you're seeing who are like World War II era people, those men died in World War II. There's a huge demographic problem Russia has and Ukraine has from World War II that continues. And that is there's many more women than men. That's why men, very easy to find a girlfriend in Russia. But you're seeing these old women. Yeah, you are. You're seeing a lot of old women, but not just old women, but older people vote who were part of the Soviet Union. They were used to voting for their top leader in Moscow. You have to understand that this is not foreign to them. It makes sense to them. And, I would say there's probably three kinds of people in these regions. I would say Most are happy to be part of Russia. A smaller part, I'm sure, wants to be part of Ukraine. But I think you also have a very strong middle part that I want to say, and I don't say this disparagingly, who have kind of a peasant mentality. And that, what is the peasant mentality? It's like, you know, whoever the national government is, it doesn't really matter as long as you let me farm my land and you let me have a life and you don't bother me. And in fact, if you do a little more for me than the other guys did, then I'm happy. And you have to understand that that is a significant part of this as well. Kherson is where I was at was very underdeveloped. And it was underdeveloped because the only development that happened there was under the Soviet Union. There is no development that's happened since 1991. So there's a backward feel to it, and I think there is a certain, again, this kind of peasant mentality that also reigns there, that is part of again, at least understanding what's happening in the Soviet Union, or sorry, in the former Soviet Union. But the interesting thing, again, going back to the Soviet Union, again, not only do people feel in these regions loyalty to Russia, they feel loyalty to the Soviet Union. People prompted mentioned the Soviet Union, mentioned it was better then, mentioned how economically it was better, how they felt. They talked a lot about the ethos in the Soviet Union, a multinational, multicultural ethos that the Soviet Union promoted and honored, that they lost in 1991. And again, the Western powers intentionally stirred up inter-ethnic conflict after that. Well, they did it even before, right? They tried to do it. They've been mucking around in Ukraine since the 1920s trying to do that. But they really started doing it big time in 1991 in Chechnya, in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Azerbaijan, in Armenia. They used those ethnic differences to try to weaken Russia. But the Soviet Union saw those differences as strengths. That was the whole issue with the national question that Lenin and Stalin promoted and believed in. And the irony of ironies is that has come back to bite them a bit. In fact, there's still a Lenin statue in the town square I was at in Kherson Oblast. There's Lenin statues everywhere throughout Russia, which I find very comforting. But Lenin is, under a lot of criticism right now because they blame what's happening on Lenin because of the national question, because he did promote the different nationalities in a big way with the different republics, right? They said, look, Lenin should have just made it all Russia. Just maintained the Russian Empire, called it whatever he wanted, and left it at that. And I disagree with that, but I mean, they do have a point. I mean, the fact he didn't do that did allow the West to take advantage of the different republics. But people understand that. They have an understanding. The truth is, the guy who's popular to almost a person is Stalin. I mean, Stalin is still almost invariably, he's one of the most popular leaders still, which is quite amazing given that since 1956, every Russian's been told how terrible Stalin was, right? There's no monuments to Stalin left, a couple here and there, but so that's an interesting thing. But still, there's loyalty to the Soviet Union. So in the town I was at, which is the new capital of the Kherson Oblast, when you come into town, there's a huge World War II museum and there's a huge flagpole. And on top of that flagpole is not the Russian flag, not the Ukrainian flag, it's the Soviet flag. And you see a lot of Soviet symbols throughout Kherson, and even more in Donetsk. In Donetsk, it's almost like going back in time. They have a giant Lenin Square there, which is a focal point of the community. And when the problem started in 2014, the first thing the right wing tried to do is take down the Lenin statue in Lenin Square, and the people who end up defending Donetsk against Kiev and who end up having a referendum to leave Ukraine, they defended Lenin. They defended that statue, and it still stands. And in fact, in Donetsk, it was the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, the branch of Donetsk, that really spearheaded the referendum there to make Donetsk an independent republic in 2014, and they were very key in helping organize the election in September of 2022 to become part of Russia. And that's the other thing, is that the Communist Party throughout Ukraine was outlawed by the government in Kiev. But now you have communists running for office in those different regions. You know, and of course the other irony is, while the U.S. says, "Oh, this was a sham election," I'm sure you heard that. Let's be reminded that Ukraine has announced there's not going to be any elections in Ukraine for the foreseeable future, right? But the West doesn't care about that. I mean, it was kind of a miracle that in Kherson any election was held. As Roger mentioned, there were some. We were in a war zone, right? Not a real hot war zone, but there were a couple polling places in the west of the Kherson Oblast near the Dnieper River that were attacked by Ukrainian forces during the election. And we were actually on our way to a polling place to observe it when a mine was discovered that had been laid under a ballot box. And so we ended up not going there. So there were, you know, that they actually pulled off an election was amazing. And what they did in Kherson, so that everyone could vote safely, they had an early voting period in early March. Then they had a regular voting period, which was the same as everyone else's, in late March, and that took place over 3 days. You could vote over 3 days. And why they, in Kherson, they spread it out was so that it would be harder for the Ukrainians to target particular, you know, it basically spread it out so it'd be harder to attack the election process. Also, they had mobile voting systems, which were greatly maligned in the West, greatly misportrayed, because they, you know, in the West, in the papers, they'd say, "Oh, people are being coerced into voting," because you'd see a photo of someone at the door of someone who was voting, and so there'd be a soldier there, and they'd say, "Oh, they were forcing people to vote at gunpoint." Not true. The mobile voting units would come to your home if you asked them to come to your house because you were infirm, elderly, etc. So that was set up as well. And also Russia, it was about 38% of the population of Russia could also vote over the internet. So that's interesting. I don't know if the new regions were able to do that or not. What I witnessed were very old-fashioned polling places. Paper ballot, you stand behind a little curtain, cast your paper ballot, you put it in a ballot box that's physically counted later. And when you go to vote, the first thing you do, you have to show ID to be able to vote. And you could use either a Russian or Ukrainian passport, which again, I think is very interesting. You know, they did not discriminate against Ukrainians. If you came and you had your blue Ukrainian passport instead of your brown Russian passport, you could vote. And again, this was a sea change from how the government in Kiev was treating people in Ukraine. Let me just make sure I've covered the few things I wanted to. Now, I'll just say the other very interesting thing was that the State Department publicly announced through their spokesperson, Matthew Miller, I think, Matt Miller, that all international observers of the Russian elections would be held accountable with all of the tools that the State Department has, or the U.S. government has at its disposal. He was very upset with observers like me, especially who went to the went to the new regions like Kherson or Donbass. And in fact, and a number of other Western governments said the same thing. In fact, the Germans were threatened by the German government, and some of them stayed longer after the elections to see if things would cool down. I was told the Polish delegation actually just defected to Russia afterwards. And when I got to Chicago, I flew from Moscow to Istanbul, then Istanbul to Chicago. When the plane was landing, they said, everyone have your passports out when you leave the plane, which is strange. Usually you walk quite a ways to show your passport for the first time. But when we got off the plane, there were people waiting, two customs agents waiting for people to show their passports. And when they got to me, they stopped and said, okay, come with us. So they were there for me. That's why the whole thing happened. So they pulled me aside and interrogated me, and a number of the rest of us were interrogated as well. So that's pretty interesting. It's very interesting how I'll just say how, when the West is at all threatened by anything, you see how weak their commitment to free speech rights and whatnot are. You saw in Germany, by the way, they shut down a Palestinian Congress in Germany and even disinvited the former prime minister of Greece, didn't even let him in the country because he was going to attend that Congress. I mean, really, the free speech rights are out the window in the West at this point, because of what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Gaza, because they feel threatened, they feel weakened. And they don't, the truth hurts them. They do not want the truth to come out about what's happening. So that's about it in terms of my presentation in chief. That was about half an hour, I guess, and then we can do questions. But I guess I'll just conclude by being, by just saying, we are still fighting the collapse of the Soviet Union. Oh, I just want to say one other thing because I was asked to mention this. So someone asked me to say, well, why should we be supporting Russia in the international, conflicts that we're seeing? And what you're seeing with Russia, again, is that Russia is not the Soviet Union. Okay, it is not socialist, obviously, and we have to remind ourselves of that. But its foreign policy in many ways still resembles Soviet foreign policy, and it's not by accident. In fact, in March of 2022, the Russian Foreign Ministry put out a foreign policy white paper setting forth the official position of Russia's foreign policy. And in paragraph 5, they said Russia is the legal successor to the Soviet Union, and as such will continue the Soviet Union's two major foreign policy platforms: the fight against fascism and the anti-colonial struggle. And in my view, Russia, even though not socialist, not Soviet, is more internationalist than China is, for example. It is playing an internationalist role very much like the Soviet Union did. It looks a lot like it. It's not the same necessarily, but it looks a lot like it. One example is when Putin hosted the different Palestinian resistance groups recently to try to get them to get agreement, to work together. That would have been something right? In the old days, Brezhnev would have done, or whatever Stalin would have done. So there are a lot of similarities, and I just think, we're Marxists, we're historical materialists, we believe in dialectics. There is no way that because three drunk guys in the woods made a decision on December 8th, 1991 to end the Soviet Union, that everything about the Russian Revolution ended at that point. That would be impossible, and it's not true. Some of the spirit of 1917 still exists. A lot of it does, and some of it still motivates the leaders of Russia, who almost to a person are old enough to have grown up in the Soviet Union, a number of them even during World War II. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Dan. And we'll return to Q&A in just a moment, but we'll take a moment to announce some of our upcoming programs, and then we'll get to the Q&A. So next week, we have Ann Garrison speaking, and she'll be speaking about the truth about the Rwandan genocide. The Rwandan genocide took place 30 years ago. It's the 30th anniversary of that genocide. It's a very complicated issue. It's an issue that most U.S. citizens are ignorant about. But it's very important for the anti-imperialist struggle, and Anne will be speaking on that. Some of you may know Anne. She is a local Bay Area resident, an expert on the great African Great Lakes region. She's a contributing editor to the Black Agenda Report, and she is also a contributor to Pacifica Radio at the KPFA station in Berkeley. So that's next week. Then the following, the April 28th, we're going to have a very interesting speaker. His name is Dae Han Sang, and he is from South Korea, and he will actually be speaking from South Korea. So he'll be getting up very, very early in the morning, or depending on your view, very late at night, to be able to make this presentation. And it's what's happening right now in Northeast Asia, which is very contentious. It's becoming a real hotspot after Palestine and Ukraine. The Northeast Asia theater is becoming very, very contentious, and we'll be hearing more about developments then. After that, we have some people tentative but not yet confirmed. So I will go back to our program. We'll have a question and answer. To be recognized for a question and answer, please go down to the reaction button at the bottom of your screen and put your hand up, and I will take questions up in the order that I receive them, more or less. And then please restrict your question or comment to about 2 minutes, and then Dan will have as much time as he would like to respond. So I'm looking at the screen right now, and I see Raj, Jean, and Janet with their hands up. So Raj, why don't you unmute yourself, and it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Thank you for going there, for all of us who are curious and telling us about this thing. Now, I wanted to say that Putin has said two things about one about Lenin. First is that it was Lenin's mistake why this has happened at the end of Soviet Union, but he also says it was the greatest disaster. But if anybody has read Soviet history, but for Lenin's promise to give right to secede, Soviet Union as a socialist country would have never risen, and Lenin would have been another czar. So, and that he defends Soviet Union. So this is I wonder if you ever talk to anybody about this issue. So that's a question about that. The second question I have is a little different. I heard from somebody that in Russia, the farm sector still remains substantially collectivized. Do you know anything about that? And I would like to know if you learn anything about that. Thank you for your talk.
You're welcome. So I don't know about the first question, but there's a second question. I don't know whether that's true. I didn't get I certainly don't get the impression that's true in the new regions, but that makes sense because of Ukraine. So I don't know about in Russia. I know that, for example, the military-industrial complex is still basically nationalized, right? There's still a lot of nationalized industry, and of course, you still have social democracy there. Healthcare is basically free, and so is education. Again, that is a holdover from the Soviet Union. They could not have not done that, basically. People would have been furious. On the Lenin question, yes, I try to talk to people about Lenin. The truth is, I'll tell you, unless you're an intellectual, most people in Russia now, they don't know much about Lenin anymore. Right? They only have the most basic knowledge. In fact, it's very interesting. With my non-political friends in Russia, and I've tried to make a lot of non-political friends because that's who you learn about. That's how you learn about the country, right? I don't represent anyone in the if you met me in Russia and if I told you what I think, I don't represent anyone here. I'm like a space alien, right? So if you meet regular people in Russia, they actually are surprised, one, that you'd be interested in Lenin. Also, a lot will confess, I don't know a lot about Lenin, they'll say, because they didn't, by the time they were growing up, even in the days of Gorbachev, they weren't reading Lenin anymore, so it's hard to have a real sophisticated discussion with them. They will only have a gut feeling about Lenin. I mean, I think they all understand that he was the kind of father of Russia and the Soviet Union in bringing the people into the modern era. But I think most people see Stalin, my anecdotal evidence, most people see Stalin as the guy who kind of took what was there in a raw form and put it into something. And brought, again, Russia into the modern world, brought it to the space age, and defeated Hitler. And so Stalin is greatly revered. There's a lot of misinformation people have about Lenin. I mean, you'll often hear the following. A lot of people believe the conspiracy that the Russian Revolution and Lenin's role of it was part of a German conspiracy to pull Russia out of the war, out of World War I. A lot of people believe that. So there needs to be a lot of work to educate people about Lenin, is the point of it. Sadly, while there's many memorials to him, while you can still visit him in Red Square, although less and less, they close it as much as they can. I was able to visit it, and I was very excited. And there was a long line of people waiting to see Lenin, which I was excited. I was glad. And they seemed like working class people. They were more salt of the earth than most people, most Muscovites you meet, who seem very Western, And that was very, good. But the memory of what he stood for in any great detail is fading. And that's a tragedy. So that's what I'll say about that. But yeah, the biggest thing people I think, again, Russia has an identity crisis because within a matter of a century, I guess, they were the Russian Empire ruled by czars. They were the Soviet Union run by communists, and then the Soviet Union broke up and they were a capitalist country. And they don't know who they are. You have people who will tell you they're imperialists. They, wish the czar was back. Others will say, a lot certainly believe they wish the Soviet Union was back. That's a majority view. The polls show that. But they have a very mixed feelings about their entire history, and they're still trying to work that out. But the one thing everyone agrees on, and the biggest holiday of the year is May 9th, Victory Day. The one thing everyone agrees on is that the Soviet Union and Russia, that their high watermark was the defeat of the Nazis. Everyone agrees on that. And that's why Stalin comes out so well in most people's eyes. He was the man. And so you'll see flags on May 9th. I was there. I was in Leningrad. And by the way, a lot of my friends still call it Leningrad. You saw a lot of red flags with Stalin's face on it that regular people were holding up and were being sold. Like they sell jerseys at baseball games. On the street, you could buy a flag with Stalin's picture on it. So, you know, he is someone people rally around because of World War II. That is their finest hour. And it was their finest hour. I mean, they have every reason to be proud of it. So anyway, that's it.
Thank you. Next up is Jean Rule. Please unmute yourself, Jean.
Yes, I think I'm unmuted. And well, Dan, thanks so much. First of all, it's such a pleasure to have someone talk about Ukraine that actually knows what he's talking about. And that's just unusual here. Usually we get a much different picture. But so it's great. And thank you for being there and doing all this. I really appreciate the research and your travels there and for coming back and appearing here. My question, or let me just say that I'm, as you know, I'm a member of Veterans for Peace, which is a, organization dedicated to the abolishment of war, and we try to restrain our government from intervening unfairly in other governments. But we have an East Bay chapter here, and we come up with a statement on Ukraine, which is somewhat different than the mainstream position. And our East Bay chapter is different also than the national chapter of Veterans for Peace. But let me just say our statement, which we passed back in 2022, on the crisis in Ukraine: bring our troops home, U.S. out of Eurasia, abolish NATO. And our points were, first of all, that the U.S. funded pro-Nazi Maidan Revolution of 2014 constituted an existential threat to Russia. Secondly, on February 24th, 2022, Russia announced a special military operation to demilitarize and denazify the Ukraine, not to attack the Ukrainian people. And fourth, our VFP position should be no U.S. proxy war in Ukraine, bring our troops home, U.S. out of Eurasia, abolish NATO, and not one penny more for Biden's cruel proxy war. So those are our statements, and I just wonder what you have to say about our position there in terms of Ukraine.
I mean, I 100% support it. I mean, I agree with every single word in there. I think it's well written and very, I mean, again, I can't take any disagreement with that. I think especially for a peace organization, that's as far as you can go. I mean, that's very good. I think for all of us, I think, you know, if folks just agree not to send any more money to Ukraine, I think that's great. I mean, that should be the demand. Then the rest of it is kind of, we get into more philosophical questions. You know, so I agree with you. I mean, again, I can't disagree with anything. I guess maybe you're kind of trying to get to the question of, well, should we go, you know, well, again, outside Veterans for Peace or outside a peace group, should we actually be rooting for Russia or whatever? You know, philosophically, I would say yes. I would go that far. But again, if I were in Veterans for Peace, I wouldn't expect you to take that position. But I mean, I think when you look at what was happening in Ukraine at the time that Russia intervened, first of all, you saw the New York Times article a couple weeks ago. They they admitted what a lot of us knew for a long time, that there were at least 12 to 14 CIA bases in Ukraine on the border of Russia since 2014, training Ukrainians to kill Russians, and that's in the words of people being trained, that's what they were trained to do. You had the 30 or so biological weapons labs in Ukraine. You had a weaponized right-wing government in Ukraine that was anti-Russian. We know that tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops were lined up on the border of the Donbass to potentially invade the Donbass. At the time, Russia intervened itself, and that essentially Russia's calculation was they had to make a decision. We could either sit here, and by the way, Russia would be better off under international law and would have a better argument for what they did if they did just wait. They could have said, let's just wait and let them invade Donbass, and then we'll have a good argument for collective self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Then we'll invade. But the people of the Donbass would tell you the following: they could have done that, but we would have been screwed. There would have been mass murder in the Donbass, right? Once the Ukrainians had come in, it would have been a bloodbath, and to extricate them would have been very difficult at that point. So Russia took the smarter strategic position, and that was that they would preemptively go in before the Ukrainian forces did themselves. I mean, given all those things, I think, as an anti-imperialist, which I am, I think that Russia did the right thing. I think they made the right decision. And I think that the people in the regions, the new regions, generally agree with that decision, and in fact wanted it to happen before. The Communist Party of the Russian Federation wanted them to go in 2014. And Putin was very reluctant to do it. I mean, Putin did not want this war. He did not. I think that he and his advisors, by the time they decided to go in, they decided they had no choice. And I agree with them on that. I do think that they had no choice at that point. But again, with that said, I 100% support. I'm shocked that you were able to get that resolution passed. In fact, that's a pretty great resolution, the way it's written. So
it's our East Bay chapter. It's not accepted by any other chapter.
Is Jerry Connon in that, by the way, or?
Oh, we have our own distinctive flavor in our East Bay folks. So
yeah, that's a good
chapter.
chat.
Urge anybody there to join Vets for Peace. It's a great organization, and they do the right things on almost every issue, not only Gaza and Palestine, but also on reproductive rights for women.
Okay, thank you, Gene.
Thank you.
I think next up is Janet Coburn, followed by Peter Fay, followed by Richard Fallenbaum, Alan Miller, and then David Welch. So Janet, it's all yours.
Thank you. And thank you, Dan, so much for your presentation today and for all your important work. Putin is called a dictator by the West, including by Yanis Varoufakis, who has been a darling pundit lately, talking about his economic policy. Would you talk a little about Varoufakis? Also, and more importantly, my understanding is that Russia is a law-abiding country. Would you talk about Russia's constitution, how Russia's government is organized, its Duma, and how it plays a role in Putin's decisions on SMO and other matters? And then finally, I'd be interested in how the vote counting in the September 22 referenda in the 4 Ukrainian oblasts was controlled and observed, and by who?
Okay. Well, Varoufakis, I mean, in my view, is, he's a social democrat. I think he's, we know what social democrats are. He's not real leftist. I think that, you know, he has his own view of Russian Putin that I just disagree with. I don't see how a guy who's as popular as Putin, you could call him a dictator. It seems to me he's a popular president, much more popular than Joe Biden. And this was basically a special election they held because, you know, he had just been reelected before the special military operations began. So, I mean, you know, he stands for elections. There were 4 parties that ran. One was communist, right? The other 3 were capitalist. I don't have a choice in this country no serious choice to vote for a socialist or a communist. It doesn't have, you know, it doesn't have the strong First Amendment rights that we have in this country. That's true. But, you know, neither do the Western European countries. Germany doesn't either. That's why they have been arresting people for speech issues and taking people's bank accounts and that sort of thing. So could Russia be a bit more of a open society? Sure, but I don't think that Putin, again, he reflects the will of the Russian people much more than Biden does, much more than Trump does. So, I don't see it. And again, I think a lot of that is projection that people have. And I have things, obviously, I disagree with Putin because I am a socialist and he's not a socialist, right? So, you know, in terms of talking about the Duma, I mean, the Duma has a certain amount of influence. They were influential on him in terms of the special military operations, and in particular, the role the Communist Party of the Russian Federation played in the Duma was really led to the special military operations happening. Because the Communist Party was the one that put in the resolution for Russia to recognize Donetsk and Luhansk as independent republics. And that allowed, once they did that and they allied with those independent republics, then they had the argument for collective self-defense to do what they did to begin the special military operation. So I think that Putin does listen to the, opposition parties, including the Communist Party, to some extent. Again, I would say when you have, you talk about civil liberties, Russia is not as progressive as the United States, but it never was. I mean, that's the other thing that people have to understand. I mean, Russia, it has a more despotic history, and had the czars for a long time, and even in the early days of the Soviet Union, certainly under Stalin, it was more authoritarian. And honestly, a lot of Russians will tell you they like that. I mean, really. I mean, that's just a fact. Like, they kind of expect that from their leaders. I mean, there is a different cultural expectation. I'll give you one little example. I mentioned Ivan the Terrible when I was talking to a friend. He goes, in Russia, we don't call him Ivan the Terrible. We call him Ivan the Formidable. So, first of all, I think it's a different culture, a different society. But again, I do not think Putin is a dictator. And I think he did not go into this war very willingly. I think he went kicking and screaming and held off as long as he could. In terms of the voting in the republics, certainly the Russians helped organize those elections, but they were largely organized by the people themselves in those republics, and the votes counted within the regions and that sort of thing. So I do believe they reflected the desire of the people there. Obviously, in wartime, it's hard. You're always going to have be a little skeptical of any elections held in a conflict zone, right? But I think it reflects what people want. And you know why also I think that? Because you don't really see some big partisan movement in those regions trying to fight off the Russians. And there isn't a huge Russian military presence. You know, in Kherson, there weren't many checkpoints. Or in Donetsk, only between cities, and they weren't very big. I mean, it wasn't like you saw troops on the streets in any kind of big way. You know, and again, to me, it's a testament to the fact that the Russians are there because the people are happy for them to be there. They're not an occupying power. The people do not view them largely. They do not view them as an occupying power. So not in those regions. Obviously, if they took over the west of Ukraine, yeah, they would be viewed that way. I mean, I understand that. But in these four regions, I don't think so. So,
Okay. Peter, so yours, what time is it at your end there?
It's 2:30.
yeah, 2:30 here as well. Let's try to end at 3 if we can. 3 hour time. So in half an hour.
So I have a question for you, and it's very, very fascinating listening to this. Having followed Soviet Union my whole life, or later Russia, and compared that to Cuba, where I visited a few times, there's always been a stark contrast between what it means to be a communist, for example, in Cuba versus, you know, a communist in the old Soviet Union, and I expect in Ukraine as well, that it seems to be more of an expression of a national allegiance, or, you know, a acknowledgement of Soviet history, etc. So I'm wondering, when you were there in Kherson, and I'm not sure if you went to Donetsk, but I'm wondering, did you actually meet members of the party, of either Communist Party or the now Russian Federation Communist Party, and did they strike you as having any ideological sophistication about what is Marxism? I mean, what does a Marxist today in Ukraine really think? What is their view of you know, the social and socioeconomic situation in Ukraine? You know, are they advocating for nationalization of industry and all these other things? I mean, what would be the view of a real dedicated communist in Eastern Ukraine?
Well, the one guy I met who fits that mold is the head of the Communist Party of Donetsk. He's the member, or he's the leader of the Donetsk, I guess, chapter of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. And he's an older guy. So when I say older, I'd say he's in his 70s. So first of all, so he lived half his life in the Soviet Union. So he's well educated in Marxism and Leninism and whatnot. I mean, he seemed very sophisticated to me. And he was the one that told me that he personally was very much a part of helping organize the referendum for sovereignty for Donetsk in 2014. And he's been very active in the parliament there as well. So this was a guy.
Litvinov? Is this Litvinov?
Yes. Yeah. And I liked him. I mean, what I would say is he sophisticated? Yes. He's very pro-Putin. I'll say that, more than I would feel comfortable with. But, you know, he thinks Putin is kind of on a parallel track with the Communist Party, which, you know, I don't know, probably says more about the Communist Party than anything. And that probably answers your other questions. I mean, yes, the Communist Party does fight for social reforms and has fought to keep Social Security and that sort of thing, and to some extent successfully. And they did push for the special military operation successfully. Do they want, you know, more nationalization? Yes. And they in fact did have a discussion with Putin of trying to resurrect socialism. This was a big meeting that they had, I want to say, in like the spring of 2022 after the special military operation. But at this moment, the way they're not really organizing for those things. They're kind of just asking for those things, right? I mean, they don't have people on the streets. They're not protesting. They will come out and organize, like, they celebrate. I was actually at a celebration with them on the anniversary of the Russian Revolution. And that was all theirs. That they did that in Red Square, and they, but that's not anti-government. It could have been an anti-government rally, but it wasn't. The point is, I would say that the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, my critique of them, which I wouldn't make publicly, but I'll make with my comrades here, is that it's not a militant organization. It's not organizing for revolution. Now, I will say right now, revolution is not on the table, given, again, how popular Putin is. They ain't going to be storming the Winter Palace anytime soon, but they certainly could be much more aggressive than they are in terms of organizing and in terms of protesting for the things you mentioned, for the socialist measures that they support. And the big thing they're criticized for is in 1996, everyone believes, even I believe even the Yeltsin people ended up kind of conceding this. The election was stolen from the communists in 1996. It's clear they won. Everyone knows they won. And the thing they're criticized for is they did not fight for it. They did not go to the streets and demand the power that they were given, right? And they really have not been a militant force since then. That was the last moment that they could have, rebuilt Soviet Russia. And they decided not to. They retreated, and they've been kind of I would say they're kind of in a period of retreat now. So it doesn't mean there's not good people in it and that sort of thing, but it's really not the militant party that they would need to rebuild socialism or the Soviet Union, So, but again, it is the times in part. It's not a time that would even be possible. So at this point, they're probably just biding their time till other times come. So
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Richard Fallenbaum, you're up, followed by Alan, followed by David.
Okay, one comment and then a question. I don't believe it's possible for a capitalist country to have a communist foreign policy, and you didn't really handle that. But it's a whole other enormous issue, which requires a whole different, maybe multiple sessions. But I do want to ask you about if you would elaborate on the question of the woke, crazy, and war crazy liberals in the West, particularly the United States. Could you say a few more words about that?
Yeah, and actually, that's a title from an article I wrote. What I would say, first of all, I guess, and I was prepared for that question. And I have something up on my screen to talk to kind of answer that. Did people see the article by Yuri Berliner from the NPR April 9th? It's in something called the Free Press. Maybe it's somewhere else too, but Early Berliner is a veteran at the public radio institution, NPR. He worked there for 25 years, okay? And he wrote an article called, I've been at NPR for 25 years. Here's how we lost America's trust. And one of the things he talks about is how NPR promoted the Russiagate scandal. And they promoted it. And again, NPR is not alone doing that. New York Times was another institution that did that. The liberal media institutions hated Trump so much that they decided, and this is what this guy says is true, that he says this is what happened in NPR. They decided Trump was so bad that they did not have to be fair with Trump. They did not have to be balanced with him, nor did they even have to be truthful. And so they happily promoted this idea that Trump colluded with Russia. And part and parcel of that was vilifying Russia as having interfered with our elections, having, literally put Trump into office somehow magically. But and Rachel Maddow was part of that, right? At MSNBC, she ended up making a career for herself promoting the weirdest conspiracy theories around Russia. Putin was blamed for the Charlottesville mass, riots. He was blamed for calling Kaepernick taking the knee. I mean, and these were liberal institutions who otherwise liked Colin Kaepernick or whatever, but who were claiming Russia was somehow behind all this stuff. And so I think there was a way in which the liberal mind was captured and in which it was turned off in terms of rational thought, and have been really led by the nose to hate Russia and to support this war in Ukraine. And I've been confronted by a lot of liberal ex-friends, I would say, who've dumped me, thinking that I'm just like the Prince of Darkness because I have some sympathy towards Russia and I don't support the war in Ukraine. I mean, this is part of the liberal, really now part and parcel of the liberal agenda is to hate Russia and to view Putin as somehow a threat to U.S. democracy. So that's at least one way in which I think the woke kind of liberal crowd has been, kind of transformed into a pro-war segment, more so than the Republicans. There's a much stronger base in the Republican Party that is anti-war now. And in fact, who's holding up the money for Ukraine now? The Democrats? No, it's the kind of freedom wing of the so-called freedom wing of the Republican Party that's done that. I think there's a little shift because of Gaza. The liberals are more supportive of Gaza than the conservatives. But on the Russia-Ukraine thing, they've definitely become this pro-war entity. Now, if you look at my article, and it's on RT, if I go down this rat hole, it's just going to take us too far. But the other thing I was referring to it in there is how there have been some kind of absurdities that have been foisted upon us that the liberal segment of society has really bought, that have also turned the rational liberal mind into mush. And again, this probably is something we need to talk a lot more about and could do a whole segment on. But one of them is this trans ideology, where this belief that a man can literally become a woman and literally is a woman if he says he's a woman. And that I do believe, and I've seen this, I do believe, while you may see it as a stretch, I do believe that, in the words of Voltaire, that being able to convince liberals of that absurdity also it allows the ruling class to convince them to support atrocities, that it just so turns off the rational mind if you can believe utter nonsense and literally stick to it against every fiber of your body telling you that it's not true. That I think it allows people to be led into other even worse beliefs. Anyway, that's a long way to say it. Trans people exist, but a man is not a woman. That's all. I think trans people should be treated well and all that. But this idea that if I literally just say I'm a woman, it's just not true. It's objectively not true. And the idea that people believe that, again, I believe results in a irrational thinking that is just not healthy.
Okay. Next up is Alan.
Dan, your reports back from on the ground and the way you carry yourself in these conversations is really informative and valuable. So thank you so much for your work and for appearing, participating in our session today. I think Roger mentioned in the introduction that you have a 30+ year association with the Steelworkers Union. And I was wondering what you have found, not only on this trip, but in all of your travels in both Russia and in the eastern, what was the eastern part of Ukraine, about unions and even steelworkers for that matter, because that is an area where there was a quite a developed steel industry. Can you comment on that?
Yes, so Donetsk is the most interesting part, place to talk about in terms of that, because it has historically had a big steel industry. In fact, Pittsburgh was a sister city to Donetsk City for that reason. And of course, recall that the big battle in Mariupol was in a steel mill, right? And yes, so the workers there have a real sense of working class solidarity. Again, a lot of it going back to the Soviet Union, and in particular, Donetsk was known as the heart of the Soviet Union because of its strong working class background. It was one of probably the most industrialized part of Russia at the time of the Russian Revolution, right? And it was a very key part of the Russian Revolution for that reason. And they're very aware of that. And I think that really does motivate a lot of the feelings they have. Anti-fascist feelings, more pro-Soviet feelings. And so, that's what makes it a very militant area. And in fact, my hope is that adding Donetsk and Luhansk, which is similar to Russia, will help radicalize Russia to some extent. It will add a more radical element. And again, that comes from the industrial working class that has, so that's my thought about that. The unions, I would say, are not that strong, but they exist. But again, the working class solidarity and that Marxist ethos is, I think, very strong amongst people.
Okay, should we go on to the next question? I think, Dan, should we go on to the next question?
Yes, sure.
Okay, so I believe it's Dave Welsh up, followed by Roger Norman.
Yes, my question, Dan, relates to Russia's current relationship with China, and there are some connections that have already been made institutionally between Russia and China in the economic field. The alliance that involves South Africa and that kind of thing. And so my question is, what is the relationship now between Russia and China? How is that developing? Can you just give a picture of that?
Well, I think it's a strong relationship. I think they've been kind of forced together because of the hostility of the West. I mean, the West has made it clear they're gunning for both Russia and China. I think the view is that the West felt they had to kind of push Russia out of the way first to get to China, and that hasn't worked out. So I think they see themselves very much as having a mutual security concern. Obviously, their relationship has been fraught over the years. We know that the Sino-Soviet split that happened after 1956, which I think was one of the most disastrous things that ever happened. And obviously, Russia's not, again, socialist or communist now, so they don't have that natural alliance that, frankly, again, they should have had when the Soviet Union did exist, which they had for a short time, but not for most of their history. But I do think that China kind of regrets that. I think they kind of realized that was probably not a good decision to break from the Soviet Union. And again, while they realize Russia's not the Soviet Union, I think they realize they have much more in common with Russia than they do with the West, which is, again, overtly hostile to them. So I think you're going to see their relationship only strengthening because they need each other desperately. And of course, they border each other. I mean, they have a very long border with each other. They have a lot of, cultural and ethnic commonality, being two Asian countries. Obviously, Russia's also European, it's Eurasian, but there's a lot of Asian culture there as well. So, I mean, I think that's a strong culture. And again, the reasons for the Sino-Soviet split are gone now. And I do think you're going to see them, increasingly come together.
Thank you.
Okay, and then let's see. Next is I guess it should be Norma because she hasn't spoken yet. So Norma, please unmute yourself.
Hi, Dan. It's a pleasure listening to you again, always.
Thank you.
Thank you. The United States in particular, but it's moved over to the rest of whoever makes themselves available nationally, is invaded by the Madison Avenue advertising tone of news. People they're all, oh yes, support Ukraine, without any information. And I wonder if that's what's affected Gene from talking about people here. I don't think that people here agree with that position. Anyway, I put up a note in the chat saying that I've seen that the the last 100 years of war have been all about our owners fighting back against the invasion, the growth of commitment to the struggle for communism. All the wars, 100 years of it. So I had another point, and I don't know if I'm going to get to be able to remember it. I didn't see that Russia thought that it was not. Russia didn't expect to be going to war against the U.S. when it sent troops into Ukraine in 22.
What's that? Can you repeat that?
Yeah, Russia did not expect that it was going to war with the United States and the allies, the hegemon, when Russia sent the troops into Ukraine. Russia did think it was doing that, not small, what's the word that?
Special operation, special military operation.
Yes.
Yeah, but I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I think they understood that they were going to war with NATO. I do think that.
Yeah, but
the collective West. I think they were surprised how much the West reacted, but they were ready for the economic sanctions. They understood that there would be the West would come down on them hard, and I do. In fact, I've heard people in Russia compare what's happening in Ukraine to Operation Barbarossa, which what they viewed was the collective West's, not just Germany's, but the collective West's assault on the Soviet Union. And then they believe that's, I think they were cognizant. And I think that, look, Putin tried to make nice with the West for a long, long time. By the time he decided on the special military operation, he would have only done it because he knew that was not possible anymore. So I think they did understand it. Again, whether they anticipated everything that happened, I don't know. but I hear a lot of people compare it to that.
It's interesting. Thank
certainly,
you.
yeah, they certainly know it now. If they didn't know it then, they know it now. That no one's under any illusion. No one's under any illusions now. So,
Okay, Raj, you'll be the
Okay.
last question, and then
Okay.
we'll wrap up.
So Dan, I think today's, it seems to me the major contradiction is unipolar versus multipolar world. And just like in before Second World War, the major contradiction was between fascism and everybody else. How to stop that. Today, United States seems to me has acquired something of an aggressiveness similar to, I don't mean to compare it to Nazi Germany, but it's a dysfunctional capitalism, a decayed capitalism requiring it more and more to control the world, be aggressive, and we've seen nothing since 1991, collapse of the Soviet Union, but for the United States to go kill tens of millions of people around the world, destroy countries. So this is the most significant struggle. And I think Putin, although he didn't want to go there, he's end up now in a place where the Soviets were against Germany in a sort of strange. Do you agree with that? I mean, I want your thoughts on multipolarity and unipolarity, if you care to share that. Thank you.
yeah, certainly I agree. I mean, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, I mean, I think a lot of us knew that once that even happened, that there would not be any check on particularly U.S. aggression in the world, and history has shown that to be true. Right, the U.S. went crazy in terms of its military expansion, and of course, after 9/11, used the pretext of that to really to do what they wanted to do anyways all along, and that is again to go to war really with the world, on many fronts, and that's what we're seeing now. So obviously, I do believe we need someone to counter that, and that is now Russia and China primarily, but aligned with Iran and aligned with North Korea and South Africa, with India. Basically, it's more or less the same division you saw during the Cold War, right? You don't have the Soviet Union, but you basically have more or less the same countries that are aligned the way they are. And a lot of that is also the global South versus the industrialized North and the industrialized Western world. If you look at what's happening in Gaza, I mean, for example, it's probably going to end up being a regional war, and it'll be critical that countries like Russia and China will back the Palestinians. I mean, I think the Palestinians' lives will ultimately depend on where Russia and China, how much they do to help them. So yeah, I think on many, many issues, we need that counterbalance. Now, again, we would prefer that it be a counterbalance that's socialist, like it was in the first Cold War, but failing that, it's important that you at least have a nationalist one. And even during the Cold War, we, as Marxists, always supported nationalist movements like Nasser's movement in Egypt, right? And of course, the West always hated those movements and tried to undermine, right? And you had the non-aligned movement. You still do, but it's not what it used to be. And again, that was all recognition that there had to be a counterbalance to Western imperialism, and we need that now, obviously, and we're seeing that happening in a very big way, and I welcome that. I support it.
Great.
Thank you.
Dan, I really appreciate you joining us. This is, of course, not the first time you've come here, and I hope that you'll feel like this is a home for you. And we're certainly going to look forward to when your book comes out and inviting you back. But do you have any final comments or summing statements? Or and finally, I know you want to get going, but there's a lot of events right now in Palestine that I'm sure you have special insights on and thoughts about. So I'll just give you back the microphone and see where you want to go.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, again, thank you very much for having me. I always enjoy our discussions and being part of the library. I'll just say that, look, as the Chinese curse goes, we live in interesting times. I mean, I'm glad to be alive right now. It's a potentially very dark time. I think my view is we probably have very dark times ahead. And what we're seeing in Gaza is kind of a, certainly a sign of that, right? The brutality in Gaza is of a type we have not seen in the way we were seeing, at least, in a long time. And of course, the numbers back up that proposition. The number of journalists killed, fastest famine, the fastest growing famine ever in human history that we know of, right? The largest number of of women and children killed in any conflict. More children killed a day than during World War II. So on any measure, it's one of the most brutal wars. And of course, the U.S. is backing it to the hilt. But I do think a new world is being born. I think a better world is being born, and I'm happy to be, because I'm happy that maybe I'll see that world, or at least my children will, and that's what gives me optimism. Even though, again, I think you may see some dark times. Until then, again, I go to that Gramsci quote, which I think I'll just end with. The old world has yet to die, the new world has yet to be born. It is the time of monsters, and it is. But I do think the new world is being born, and for that, I put a lot of hope.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you, everybody, for joining us at Sunday morning at the Marxist Library. I'll look forward to having you join us next week. So have a good day, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks,
Cheers.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Niebel Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, at yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Niebel Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.